to the asset sale structure. In a share sale, the buyer takes the employment relationship continues, so there's no change. It was a company where the employees are members of trade union. The trade union arrangements continue. So the buyer doesn't take this into consideration in determining what they think the deal is worth. A key one for buyers is the terms of a seller's representation and warranties and the scope. So how long? For us, in terms of taxes, we would recommend a minimum of six years, because that's how far back the tax authorities can look back at. But for other obligations, sort of quibble. So depending on what the buyer's appetite for risk is and how much of a negotiator they are, that determines really what the scope and the term of seller's representations and warranties are. To make sure that there is money in the event of a breach. So the seller says, oh, well, I promise you I've paid all payee, and there are now standing fines and penalties. And then 3 months after the deal is completed, you see a letter that's, had been sent to the seller that didn't come, that the seller just never shared with you, or which the seller wasn't even aware of, but it was something that had accrued before the deal completed. The only way to get that money back is if you had some money in escrow. Escrow we find to be very useful, particularly for paying unpaid statutory obligations. So the key thing that the buyer has to be concerned when you determine the escrow arrangement is how much are we putting aside, and for how long will this money be in escrow. Now, for the seller, they want their money now because of time value of money. But the good thing about the escrow arrangement, however, is that the money is put in escrow and it bears interest. And if risks do not crystallize, the seller takes the money and the interest and walks away. So that's one way of sweetening the deal for the seller. For seller considerations, one of the biggest concerns really is the scope and the term of the indemnities, representations, and warranties, because any of this crystallized, the buyer is going to ask for money back from money we paid to you. And this is where the lawyers really come in to sort of negotiate the scope, and push back on what they think is unreasonable. And also just sort of advise the buyer, the seller, on ensuring that, look, we've paid off this money, so we can't give you representation because there's no liability. Disclosure schedules are also very important. How many employees exactly do you have? Are you owing any of those employees? Are there, what kind of litigation do you have? Any threats of litigation, ongoing disciplinary procedure, things that may potentially crystallize into risks, which is what the buyer's chief is going to be trying to ensure. They typically want a disclosure schedule that is lean, such that the seller can, such that if disclosure schedule is not, if the seller's team decides we're going to give the buyer a lean disclosure schedule, the buyer's team is happier because they're then able to claw back the escrow arrangement, because very likely some of those risks will crystallize. Seller is also concerned, again, as I said, there are escrow arrangements, because for them, I've sold this company, I've walked away, I want my money. So negotiating how much and how long the money is going to be in escrow is also, for the seller, a really big deal. Sometimes, again, so this is the retention of key men is also a risk that comes up in even a share sale. So sometimes the key men decide, I don't like the buyer. I mean, I know this new company, I don't like them, I don't want to be working for them, and they intend to resign as the deal is closing. But for the buyer, part of the reason why they wanted this company was because they wanted the people who were running the deal, making sure the business was running. And that's also some negotiations going on between the seller and his key man. it may well be that the seller may decide that to offer some sort of consideration sweetness, offer to say, look, we'll pay you XYZ amount of money if this deal closes, and if you agree to stay on for a year. Or in those situations where the seller is a majority shareholder and selling down just a portion, they may be willing to say, look, we'll offer you a percentage of the shares for this amount of money. What the seller does, and the lawyers will typically sort of advise on the legality or otherwise of whatever seller is offering to the key men to keep them in. So in mergers and acquisitions, because the ISA requires that you engage with trade unions, if it's a unionized entity, you will of course have a conversation with the unions about the merger. What do you expect to happen? So one of the big considerations the parties have to decide as they're having the conversation on whether to merge or not to merge is, will the enlarged company retain all employees? If that's not going to happen, that will feed into the conversation with the trade unions. There's also the question of, so yeah, of course, once the merger happens, the dissolved entity, will cease to exist. The large entity will assume all obligations. The question, therefore, is, how do we deal with that? Do you want to, before the merger is completed, ensure that both parties clean up and pay up all statutory obligations before they come on board, so that the enlarged entity doesn't have a lot of debt? Or are you then going to decide that, you know what, we want this deal to happen, the company we're merging with doesn't have that much cash, but we'll factor in these sums that are paid statutory liabilities, the amounts, into the cost, into the share valuation. So it was going to be 2 shares to 1, we'll say 1.5 shares to 1. Then post the merger, there is also the issue of, so you've taken on those new employees, and typically one of the orders you're going to have in the application you make to court to sanction the merger is that all that employees, transfer to the new employer without more on the same terms or as their existing employment contracts. And then you come in and then you have employees on the same level with 2 completely different benefit plans. How do you deal with that? And so are you going to make changes? Do you want to have a conversation about changes before the merger happens or post the merger? How is that going to happen? And this also sort of ties into employees who are leaving. And so sometimes it is the case that employees in the entity that was dissolved are entitled to very generous severance payments. And if the resultant entity wants to change the terms of engagement and say, look, we want to keep all employees, but we can only pay so much, many of the employees will choose to resign. So how do you deal with that? This is a conversation that has to happen, even though it's something that actually happens post-merger. It's a conversation that needs to start before the merger is completed, so that the resultant entity has a sense of what the obligations look like before the merger is completed. Again, some of the issues we saw in the share deals will come up, where they have misclassified employees as casual workers who actually are, truthfully employees and should be entitled to various benefits that weren't paid. What happens? How do you deal with that? What happens where when the shares came to continue? Are you going to discontinue? How will they discontinue? So in determining whether you're going to discontinue, are you just going to pay the benefits to the employees? Are you going to give them shares in the resultant entity? What's the plan? And these are some of the concerns on the merger you would typically see. And this and the parties have to have a conversation around how to resolve this before the merger is completed. And so regulatory concerns, these will typically come up in the context of an asset sale and in the context of a merger. So in an asset sale, because all that the buyer did was just buy the assets and then moves the assets and the employees, it takes them from the seller's business to a new company. Where any of the key men are foreign nationals, then the buyer must have expatriate quota approvals. That takes some time to obtain. There's a process and procedure for obtaining that. But it's important that the buyer does know that this is something they need and start that process well before the deal is completed. Otherwise, they will have key men who are willing to come in, but they can't employ those key men immediately because they do not have expatriate quota approvals for that. And then sector regulatory approval. As most of us are aware, the DPR did release some guidelines in 2000, pretty much requiring employers who were going to release employees from their services permanently to obtain their approval. To the extent that the deal, and this is in an asset sale, this will be the seller's concern. In a merger, this will be the resultant and large companies concern, to the extent that some persons are going to lose their jobs. Then conversations need to be had with the DPR early enough, explaining the modalities and what's going on and what the employees are going to get. Now, in the context of an acquisition, actually, and in any of those three set structures we've looked at, typically the buyer and the resultant entity will also want to bring in their own persons into the deal to manage the company. And so if it's a financial services sector, for all top management personnel, then the CBN's call will be required. These are, in a nutshell, the issues that you will typically find in the context of mergers and acquisitions. So yes, in conclusion, there are labor and employment concerns, but really you can mitigate these concerns if the investor has conducted extensive due diligence, pays attention to the text of, to what's going on before the transaction, understands clearly in their head what they're trying to achieve before they get in. So it's usually useful for both the investor and the employers to clearly identify the dynamics, identify the objectives of what they're trying to achieve. And if that is done, then the less likely that the investor will have unforeseen liabilities. And that's it from me. I thank you all very much for your time. And I can take your questions now.
Okay, thank you, Mary, for the presentation. I would just like to ask if you could turn your screen, your slides back to from the beginning.
Okay.
First, second page.
Let's see if I can do that. Okay, and then the last one.
Because I was wondering, I see you've dived straight into the meat of the issue, but I was wondering if you could speak more to the regulatory aspect, because I noticed that from your presentation, most of it is focused rightly so to what the lawyer should look out for in handling a merger and acquisition transaction. But could you please also, in a few minutes, speak to the regulatory issues involved in terms of consents, approvals that may be required in the course of a transaction of this magnitude? Because I see that you've mentioned a number of things like expatriate quotas and all of that. But then are there supervisory um, actions that may need to be also obtained in the course of such a transaction?
Okay, so as Riley pointed out, I just limited my presentation to labor issues. I didn't go into the transaction dynamics. But so in the context of an acquisition, first things first, of course, is determine the structure you want to use, and if it's an asset acquisition, it depends on the sector you're looking at. So if the asset you're looking to buy, for instance, is a license of a telecoms company, will absolutely need the approval of the NCC. That is the sector regulator approval, and would also need the approval of SEC. If the shares we're looking to acquire in the context of a share deal is up to 50% of the company, we'll need the SEC approval. And if the regulated entity, we would need sector approval. So you need DPR for the oil and gas. You need, actually, if it's in the telecom sector, if it's 10% and above, you need the NCC's approval. In the financial services sector, you will need the CBN's approval, I believe, for 5% and above.
But how about labor related organizations? Are there any we need to bear in mind? Your of course DPR now with the issue of letting go of workers, but I'm maybe more in terms of NSITF, PENCOM, and all of those.
Well, actually no. So because the PENCOM, for instance, all that the investor will be concerned about is to ensure that all payments have been done. You really truly, particularly in share deals where you take on the obligations, you step into the shoes of the employer. You want to be sure that whatever the valuation is an accurate valuation. So it would make no sense if you value the company at $10 million and then the obligations owed to, in terms of tax and pension and NSITF remittances and ITF is well over $2 million. It would make no sense. So what parties would typically do if that has been identified is to either just pay $8 million and then directly the investor make sure that the back payments are made, or the investor says, look, I will give you this $2 million, I'll put them in escrow if you pay this off. Well, then again, there is the issue of, so if you were doing, for instance, an asset sale, no. So if you were doing a transfer, for instance, and that would typically happen actually in the context of an asset sale, and the employee wanted to cherry pick employees, and you didn't want to go the route of termination and employment, which I would find odd actually in an asset sale, because the whole idea of an asset sale is to minimize employer obligations. You would typically need the consent of the authorized labor officer if you are doing a transfer. Like I said, that would be odd. I haven't quite seen one structured that way. What we tend to see actually is the termination and reemployment, and so the seller terminates everybody's employment, pays them off, and then the new employer takes on the obligation, takes on the employees. The senior ones do. Sometimes the concession that they are able to negotiate is that even though they're terminating my contract in the seller's business, I want continuation of employment in this new business. I want you to recognize my years of service, particularly in entities where benefits are tied to the years of service. So that's some of the concerns that we may see in that respect. Due diligence will typically take anything between 6 weeks to 2 months or more, depending really on the sector in particular and the records of the company. Then the actual approval process we're going to the SEC. Will take another 3 to 4 months. Of course, the causes that the company we're looking at is not listed.
Okay. Okay. So, if I may take another bite at the cherry before I give way to the audience. From your experience, how easy has it been managing trade union issues in this sort of transactions, especially for those transactions that that are very out there in the public domain, um, where you could then see that there's so many vested interests, because the experience, at least from a public standpoint, is that you see trade unions then
Hi, Jamil. Hello, Jamil. Hello,
such
Jamil.
agreement.
Jamil, sorry, I lost you for a minute there.
Hello, can you?
I lost you for a minute, so could you
Okay.
please?
Okay, so my question again is, from your experience practically now, how easy has it been, or what is the best approach to managing trade union intervention in this sort of transactions, especially in situations where you find trade unions insisting on some contracts that are not entirely contractual? And I was also wondering who should be more worried by such interventions, the buyer or the seller, considering the fact that the collective bargaining agreement or whatever agreement would have been signed by the seller.
Again, that depends on the structure of the transaction. An asset sale, that's the seller's headache, because all I'm doing is buying the assets and I'm walking away. So the seller has to deal with the employees who are left in his employment. In the context of the share position, well, that eventually then becomes the buyer's issue, because the buyer is stepping into the shoes of the old seller. And so the collective bargaining agreement is between the new buyer and the trade unions. They will have to either renegotiate, or they will, sort of honor the terms that are already existing. I find that with trade unions, they're not. The biggest problem is, are you letting off employees?
Yes.
So if you're not letting off employees, it's easier to have a conversation. If you're letting off employees, then they want to know how much their employees are getting. And that's a conversation, well, that will have to happen anyways. How much are the employees going to get? In this market, I haven't quite seen yet and sort of trade unions going to court to sort of block transactions. I haven't seen that yet in this market. I do know that in some other jurisdictions in Africa, employees and trade unions tend to do that. But so far here, it's really, right now, my experience with trade unions is it's about the money. So are we letting off employees? And if you're letting off employees, how much are the employees getting?
Okay. Again, there's a new, well, for me personally, there seems to be this new concept I'm hearing extensively for the first time from your presentation. This concept of cherry picking key employees. I would like you to ponder over a point, and that is, in cherry picking employees, number one, I think is Section 10 of the Labor Act, which requires the consent of the employee to being transferred to a new employer. How does that work? If the buyer, for instance, says want A, B, and C employees to be moved, to be retained as part of the transaction, as part of the transaction, I assume that those employees would necessarily need to give their consent. And if they do not, have you, in your experience, found that to have any impact on the transaction?
Well,
Uh, Related note, I also know that for a shared, no, for an acquisition, a major transaction dynamic that involves an asset sale, for instance, if I'm correct, I think that would usually involve a lot of redundancies. What I've seen in my limited experience is you then have the union insisting that certain employees must not be rendered redundant, and a certain class should be the ones, basically trying to dictate who should go and who should not go. So I think they're both tied. How have you managed such a situation in such a transaction before, if you have?
okay, so in relation to cherry picking, you recall that when I was speaking, I had said that one of the things that the seller has to do in the context of an asset sale is have a conversation with the employees that the buyer wants. Sometimes a deal will not go through if the buyer is not going to get that consent because they don't want the business without those employees. And so, of course, the employee's consent is required. So the question for the seller is, what are you offering to the employees to get their consent? Sometimes employees are just happy to have another job and so they'll sign on. Sometimes employees want more to sign on. So it's a conversation really between the seller and the employees, as opposed, strictly speaking, to a conversation between the buyer and the employees. So it depends again on what the drivers of a transaction is. If the seller is saying, I'm only interested in these assets if you guarantee me that these employees will take on employment with me, then that is really the seller's problem. If the buyer is saying, if it's a case where the seller is saying, particularly in auctions where the seller just wants to sell their assets, there they have a lot more power. And so it's for the buyer to engage with the particular employees they want to retain, get their buy-in, and offer them sweeteners to agree to that will make them willing to take on employment with them. Really, bottom line, it's money. It's how much really at the end of the day for these cases of key man issues, it really boils down to money and benefits. So what are they getting apart from their salaries? What other benefits are you throwing in for them to agree to? And those are usually typically valuable employees anyways. Now, in relation to your second question about whether, again, it depends on how this transaction is structured and who has, in terms of the power, the transaction, where the power resides. If all the buyer is interested in, strictly speaking, is the assets and doesn't want employees, it's really the seller's headache as to how many employees can they retain after the business has done. And you need to put it in context. If the entire division or the business is sold, there's going to be redundancies, whether the unions kick up a force or not, there are going to be redundancies. And it's really up to the seller to decide who am I going to keep on. So yes, the unions tend, as I said, to kick up a force. And sometimes they would go as far as declaring a trade dispute. It's up to so it depends again on whether the seller just wants to close this up as quickly as possible, or if they think, I'm sorry, you can't tell me who to take on and who to leave. What we found is sometimes the parties reach a compromise and decide to keep on some employees and then over time ease them out.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you very much. I will now invite comments and questions from participants. If you intend to ask any question, there is a button at the lower portion of your screen where you can click to raise your hands, and that would indicate that you have questions to ask. Otherwise, you can also indicate in the chat box by typing your question or just indicating that you wish to ask a question or make a comment. But so far, I haven't seen any indication of that. So I'll just unmute everybody for a moment just to get an indication of who the first person to ask the first question.
Telling me all manner of nonsense.
So is there anybody with a question?
Yes, hi, I did to here. Yes, I have a question. Okay, so Mary, thank you for your presentation. Merger or an acquisition by share sale or a merger. If the employee, if an employee is employee refuses to move to the other company. So what, yes, the acquirer, whatever, the acquiree is stepping into whatever. Anyway, if a new contract of employment is issued by the acquiring company and the employee refuses to accept the terms of that employment, will it be considered a termination or a or resignation by the employee? Is my question clear?
Yes, it is. I think Mary is on mute. Okay, she's going to answer your question now. Mary?
Can you hear me?
Yes, Mary, we can hear you now.
All right, so this is a question in relation to a share sale, I assume, where the buyer has acquired, has bought the shares from and so it's still the same entity, but the new company wants to introduce new contract of employment. Is this in the context of a merger or in the context of a share sale? If it's in the context of a share sale, where all that has happened.
No, sorry, Mary. If it's a share sale, the employing entity remains the same. So I think it will be.
So it's a share sale. It's a share sale.
No. For a share sale, the employment contract doesn't change because the employer doesn't change. It's just the shareholders that change, right? So yes, I think it would be probably more for a merger. So where there's going to be a new entity.
Okay, so in the context of a merger where there is, the resultant entity effectively has employees with employees of and who have two different sets of employment contracts. And you want to sort of, with this action, an issue that comes out post-integration. Well, if the employee does not want the old contracts, the only option open to the employer is to terminate the employee and pay them whatever that was due to them under their old contract. Remember that in the merger, the prayers you're asking is to transfer the employees on the same terms as their current employment without more. So typically we would have each employee's consent. But it's one of those ones where we don't need consent because the court sanctions it. So the employee is employed in the larger enlarged entity, but they have a different kind of employment. And the employer, as part of the integration process, is saying, I want everybody to be on the same terms. I want to be on the same. I want the same grading system. I want the same benefit system. And the employee says, I don't want this. The only option open to that employer actually is to terminate the contract and pay the employee under their existing contract, not under the new contract. Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah, because the transfer happened under the terms of the existing contract.
Okay, so why will this be seen as a termination and not a resignation? Because if, as an employer, I've offered you alternative employment and you refuse it, should I not then ask you to resign?
Let's put it this way: you took me on my existing contract.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is the basis on which that merger happened. We're transferring all employees of company B to company A on the existing contract. Now, as part of your integration, you want everybody to be on the same structure, which is an understandable, concern. But I'm saying, thank you so very much. I prefer my old structure. And I don't want to leave. So I'm saying to you, if you don't want me here on those terms, you need to sack me. Remember to amend the contract of employment with the consent of the parties. And the employee is saying, I'm not giving you my consent. And you can't force the employee to give them their consent.
Okay,
and if you don't that employee, you continue to pay them on their old contract.
Okay, that's clear. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see if there's any other person with a question. Any other questions? Any other questions or comments? Okay. There doesn't seem to be any other questions, which is quite odd from our experience in this webinar. But okay, I'm trying to unmute you, Mary. Okay, hello, Mary.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, one more question, John. Sorry, another question just came to mind. So in the case of an asset sale, or I don't know, either asset sale or merger, just a general question. If you move if all the employees accept, so I'm not sure which one it is now, merger. I'm not sure which one. Okay, asset sale. So in the event of an asset sale, you've moved all the assets to another company. All the employees have accepted to move to the new company. How do you, just general question, is there a way, how do you liquidate the empty company now if there are no employees there? Is it possible to liquidate that company without employees?
Absolutely. There's no reason why you can't liquidate. There's no reason why you can't.
A completely empty company without employees, nothing.
Yeah, because typically in the context of a liquidation, typically you would have actually sort of moved all the terminated the contract of employment of all the employees and paid them off, and then But what will happen, at least what I have said in practice, is that you leave very skeletal staff, typically the finance team, 1 or 2 persons who sort of know where the monies are and what's going on, and they retain on the payroll until all the assets have been sold. And all debts paid, and then so you would have very slim 2 to 3, maximum 4 people left. The liquidator, you can get hold of, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and I heard Mary mention that you could have situations where a union has gone to court to set aside merger and acquisition. Have you ever seen any such?
Like I said, I haven't seen that in this market. But I haven't seen that in this market. But in other jurisdictions, yes. And when that happens, the deal is just, they actually just even go to frustrate the deal because they've not been able to reach during the negotiations with the parties. They're not happy with the transaction, with what's going on, and they go to court to say, we don't want this to happen. And of course, once it's in court, one of the prayers they're asking is to keep it on hold until parties are able to resolve. But I haven't seen that tactic in this market yet. So we're fine so far.
Oh, I see. That's interesting. So, but what would you say has been the most troubling issue you've dealt with from a labor law perspective in this kind of transactions?
I think for me, it's just the hidden costs. And I think for me, it's really the case, for me, it was really just the case of the casualty of workers. And they have been around for a while. So the question was, how do we deal with payments? They haven't taken leave. And so an employee who's entitled to, for instance, in a year, 15 working days, which translates to 21 days, has been in employment for 12 years. If we are retaining that employee as a buyer, it means that from day one, they're not going to be at work for 1 year. We're going to pay them for 1 year for being on vacation.
Okay.
So you want an employee who's on vacation for 1 year and who you're paying a salary for an entire year.
No, sorry, could you take that again? Why is the employee on leave for 1 year?
So the employee was classified as a casual worker.
Yes.
And turning up at work every day for the past 10 years, and every day gets daily salary, strictly speaking, a salary a wage for the day. However, because, and typically the parties who are then doing this, who are acquiring a lot more savvy, I'm looking at those casual workers, and even though you've treated them as casual workers, the fact remains that they are actually your employees because it's been more than 3 months since they've been working for you. And by law, you should have given them a contract of employment. You haven't done that. And so even though you have not in your head treated them as your employees, the fact that they've worked for you consistently for 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 years, they were entitled to pension, which you hadn't paid. You were required to have deducted pay on their behalf and remitted, which you haven't paid. In computing the employees on your payroll, who you should have paid, ITF on who's, ITF and the NSITF contributions under the ECA, you haven't done that. Those employees were entitled to benefits like every other employee, vacation period, for instance. They haven't taken it in that long.
Okay. I'm just wondering, really, off the top of my head, because when it comes to issues of employment benefits and rights and obligations, of course, it's basically, or let's say generally contractual. So at what point does it become possible for a buyer to then impute an employment, a permanent employment relationship between the seller and the employee if there's no agreement to that effect? And if I'm acting for the seller, for instance, am I not entitled to push back? Because I guess all of that will be built by the buyer into the transaction, the purchase price and all.
Okay, so I'm going to wear the buyer's cap in answering your question.
Yes.
I'm not looking to buy liabilities from you. And I'm not looking to buy potential litigation from you either. And so even though the best scenario for an employment relationship is to have it written, there can be employment by conduct, which is what has happened here. And this employee has turned up to work for you every single day for the past 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. I'm not quite sure. I hear you about your concerns, but as I'm advising my client, I'm going to say to them, well, we're either not taking these employees on at all, we're going to leave them with the seller, or they need to fix this now. Because it's going to come back and haunt me. All I need is one disgruntled employee speaking to one of their lawyer friends and, we're in court. And as we both know, NIC will fine for them.
Yeah.
So why do I want that? If I know what the risk is today, why do I want that? So if the seller is saying, I don't want that, I said, fantastic, please, all of these employees you will take with you. I'm not taking them on. It's either that or you're going to sort that out, or I will take it out of the acquisition price. Some buyers have a large appetite risk and they don't mind, and they want the deal so much, and they decide, you know what, do the maths, we'll take that on. But some buyers don't want that. And if they don't want that, this is my advice to them.
Okay, thank you, Mary. There's another question from Mr. Oluniyi Adediji. I'll unmute him to ask his question, even though he had typed it before. So, Niyi, Please ask your question. Hello, Ni.
Hello, good evening.
Yes, good evening. Please go ahead with the question.
Yeah, thank you, Mary, for this wonderful presentation. My question, which I like that because I thought maybe I will not be available when you'll be answering it, is that we have some companies that have friendly policies in terms of incentives to employees. In a situation where a buyer does not have that kind of policies in place, how would that situation be treated, be addressed? Hello, did you get my point?
Yeah, I did. I got your question. Yes, I did.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So it depends on the acquisition structure.
Okay.
If it's an asset sale, typically an asset sale, this is what the buyer is looking to avoid. They don't want contracts that they don't understand. They want contracts that are in line with their own business ethos. So in an asset sale, it's fairly easy to avoid this one because then you're renegotiating terms and conditions of employment with every single employee you agree to take on, and the starting with fresh. In a share sale where there's a change in the shareholder structure, that's slightly more complicated because you're saying I'm going to change the terms of employment, and the employee can say what's agreeable to this. And the employee is not agreeable to that. The only option open to you is sack. And if you sack the employee, you're still going to pay them severance benefits based on their old terms of employment, anyways. But I find also that many employees want to stay on, and so some of them are going to be willing to sign off on the amended, on the revised terms. But you're likely to lose some employees if you change the terms, and so you just have to bear at the back of your mind that I may lose some employees, and just be ready to pay them whatever their severance benefits were under the old contract you're looking to phase out.
Now, thinking about this question by Ni. Oh, but first, Ni, does that answer your question? Okay, I think it's gone now.
Yes, please. Thank you, Mary, for this.
Okay, so but thinking about Ni's question, although, and you'll need to forgive us here that we're overflogging this issue because you are the expert. If by contract, an employee is entitled to certain perks and benefits that he's gotten used to over time, such that they've become part of the contract, of his contract of employment, and the new buyer is coming up with withdrawing some of those rights, really. Sometimes maybe without necessarily amending the contract. I know some of them would terminate and re-employ. But if that is not the case, this issue about this contractual principle of no variation of a written contract without consulting or agreement of the counterparty, how do you think that could play out in the employee challenging such variation?
Well, like I said, really, truly, the fact that you need consent, and if you don't get employee consent, the only option I can see for you is to sack that employee. I don't see anywhere around it. Now, I don't know if the employee will go to court about that and decide they're not happy and try to lay claim to, I don't know if an employee will go to court, actually, and that's the truth. I haven't seen an employee go to court to challenge that, to be honest. But what I had seen before is where, and this was in was Union Bank actually, where they used to pay for everybody, whether you were still in employment or not, a certain amount of money, as 13th month or something. And the new buyer wanted to change that, stopped it, and the employees went to court. And they got it. They said that the custom had, that the custom had a reason and all of that. I suppose in their own case, and they possibly didn't go through the formal process, I will tell an employer, my client who wants to change terms of engagement, to have a conversation with employees, let them know when it will become effective, ask them to sign up on it. Some employees will sign off, some will not sign off. Anybody who says they're not signing off, please just sack them and give them the sacking them. Yes, if you say you don't have the money for that, please just terminate the contract, pay them what they're entitled to under their old contracts. Just follow whatever the contract says. If it's 3 months notice, give it to them. If it's 1 month notice, give it to them. And pay them whatever they're entitled to. Because you can't force them to take on your new term. They can decide to sue you for that, and clearly, like you said, so you need employee consent to vary the contract. If what you're introducing is a variation that is detrimental to them, you need the employee consent. If the consent is not coming, the only way out of that I can see is to terminate the employment relationship. You can also decide that, you know what, you are so valuable, I will keep you on those terms. But what you've cost effectively is that you have employees on different terms, and that is, sort of packing trouble for yourself in the future. But the next time you look to amend terms and contracts of employment, the employees who know that there's some people that got away with staying on with their old terms are not going to concerned to any change.
Hi, Mary, this is Aditutu. Sorry, just a follow-up on that question, on your response. So the first thing, or two follow-ups. The first one is that you said that if the person doesn't accept, the employee doesn't accept, it's advisable that you just go ahead and terminate the employee. How do you address the this NIC position now that you should give reason for termination? That's number one. Number two, I think that Oluni's question was not only in terms of the contracts of employment, but also the policy, so perhaps handbook or whatever it is. So not a lot of benefits are not in your contracts of employment, then you're in the handbook. So if the new company, the acquiring company has a handbook or amends the policy, the company policy, such that you lose certain benefits, are you saying that the amendment of those policies or that handbook needs to be discussed with the employees and approval received or consent given?
Okay, so the first question, if I understood you correctly, was, sorry, I remember the second question now more than the first question. Can you repeat your first question again?
First question was that, you said that if an employee doesn't give his consent to amendment of the terms, it's best for the company to go ahead and terminate that employee. So how do we reconcile that with NIC and give reasons for termination?
I will set out the reason in the termination letter. Due to business reasons, the company is no longer able to pay this. We've asked them, we've spoken to employees, and some employees have agreed, employees not willing to agree, we're not able to pay them, this is why. Let them go to court and tell the court that my reason doesn't make sense. And I'll give the court the numbers. These are one of those I'll tell my clients, give a reason, tell them exactly why you're sacking them. So they want to go to court, it's fine. We just can't afford this money. We don't have that kind of money. That's all we're saying. From a business perspective, we can't afford this.
Okay, that's clear.
Yeah. So on the second one, again, it depends on how savvy the employees are. That's the truth. If you want to amend your terms and contracts of employment such that you need to take out a benefit that an employee is entitled to, it depends on how strongly the employee feels about that benefit.
Not contract of employment now, the handbook or the policy. So if for instance, you mentioned 13th month. So let's assume that, okay, maybe not 13th month, let's say car policy. So the company has a policy in place that says that they will give you a company car when you get to a particular level. At some stage, which I see that a lot of companies are doing now because of the price of cars, the companies are now taking back that benefit and saying that, oh, they're no longer giving cars. How is that addressed? Is that seen as, because obviously when you sign a contract for employment, the handbook is taken to be part of your contract. So a change in the company policy, does it require the consent, because I mean this is a benefit that you have looked forward to, you had anticipated that you will get when you get to a particular level, and the company suddenly changes the policy. Does that is that seen as a violation of your contract requiring your consent, or can the company unilaterally amend its policies?
I would say that it depends on how, in the first place, that benefit was drafted in the handbook, for instance. And so, if the benefit at the time when it was drafted, everybody understood, and I've seen language where they're saying this benefit is this benefit, but the company reserves the right to change that benefit. If that is the language of the benefit, it is easier for the company to say, hey, look, we're changing this benefit. It is slightly different where we didn't have that language. It's become, I can say that with the doctrine of legitimate expectation has arisen, an employee who pushes back might get the courts to agree in their favor that they're entitled to it. But flip side, the employee is out of our job anyway, and we both know that. It's a matter of time, and they will lose their job. So it's one of those ones where I know, strictly speaking, even though under the doctrine of legitimate expectation, I could get this benefit, but I'm going to, as an employee, I'm going to weigh it against, I win this battle, will I win the war? So if I don't mind losing the job anyway, then I don't mind what happens after I get my court to agree with me that I'm entitled to it. And I don't mind. But if I mind, I'm not quite sure. So that's how I'll answer that. So first of all, the structure of the language. The language already from the onset, everybody knew that, yes, this is what we're giving today, but we can change it tomorrow. It's harder to make that claim. Even if it is such that we think that if a custom has a reason, what I have seen my own clients do is begin an engagement process and say from next year or from so and so time, we're changing it. They don't just unilaterally change it. We have a conversation, there's a time frame, people know this is going to happen.
Thank you.
I know you continue for us.
No, good night. I know that most of those things you are doing them for the last time.
When we go to hospital or go to chemist, we know how much we use and buy the drugs.
So it's just better to
So
go.
we get it free from here. You might
Jamu?
To say, hello?
Okay, Jamu, I was wondering.
Sorry. So I've been speaking to myself. I didn't know I was mute. Sorry, I said so many things. Well, basically, I was just thanking everybody for being part of this presentation. Many thanks, especially to Mary Ekemizie for taking time out to prepare this slides and share our ideas and expertise on this topic. I was also saying that the next webinar will be next month. The webinar takes place every last Friday of the month. And in advance, we'll be sharing the topics for discussion with everybody. For those who have an interest in labor and employment law and are lawyers, call to the Nigerian Bar. The email address of the association has been shared in the group chat. you might want to send us an email signifying your interest. And also to note that the audio recording of this webinar will be made available in due course upon request. So you might want to send an email on that also. So on this note, in the absence of any other comments by Mary herself, I'd like to thank everyone for staying with us till this time. And we hope to see you next month at the next webinar. Thank you all. Mary, any last words?
Thank you all. Absolute thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you, and thank you all for the questions. And have a good evening all.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Enjoy your weekend.
Yeah. Yeah, finished.
Yes, slides will also be sent to everybody by email. If you're not a member of the association, you might want to drop your email address in the chat group here before leaving. Thank you.
I think everybody. This is what's my courses? What's in the joint? What's my joint? I don't know what this is. I don't know what this is. This is a member of the association. Member of association. I don't know who this is. Let me check. Okay. I don't know who this is. So no, I don't even know who this is. This is a member of association also. Okay. So we have to leave. How do we leave? Yep.